Hello, Beyond Awesome here with the Outpost Dominion podcast. And today I have a special guest, Breppert. Is that how you say it?
That is how you say it. Hello.
Okay, so Breppert is most well known for having the Dominion Sparkle website, which has the live leaderboard, and you can look at your rating and everything on there. So, Breppert, tell us how you first got into Dominion.
Yeah. So I think the story of how I first got into Dominion is a bit simpler than a lot of the people who have been on the podcast so far. So I think I got into Dominion the way I think a lot of people got into Dominion, which is I had a friend that played, and he brought the game over to kind of the first game night that we had. And he set the cards out and just started playing. He's a good player, and that first night that we played, he set out Bridge the first turn, the first game, and he set out Dunes the second game. Those are the two games we played. And he beat up on me pretty badly. I was still trying to figure out if Silver was a good card. I had no idea. But then we kept playing over the course of months and months. And after maybe 4 months or so, we were able to be pretty even in the competitive games, but not before I had taken my fair share of, things like Knights, destroying my deck, and Torturer Chains, and all of those things that the first time you play Dominion 2, you have no ability to understand. But obviously, I've grown to like the game quite a bit and played it quite a lot over the last a little over a year and a half now. So I've been playing maybe a little bit less long than Dan from last week's podcast, but still kind of one of the newer players around the community.
Wow, Goons and Bridge. That's something.
Yeah, he was not kind. You would think, when you set cards out, when I introduce people to the game, I set maybe stables out, and, I have, my payload is horse traders. I try and make it a little challenging, but he did no such thing. He was not that kind to me.
So you've been playing for only a year and a half. Do you think that at all, maybe being a newer player actually helps because you're not.
So I didn't come into the game until after Adventures was not only out, but was making fun had actually finished programming it for the online Dominion. So I came in pretty late. So I haven't really had a lot of learning curves other than Empires after kind of learning initially how the game works. So I never really, there's this transition where kind of big money and kind of sloggier games were kind of, those were kind of the decks that people thought about as the basic decks, and then they became engines. I kind of came in when kind of the thought in Dominion was that engines are always best if possible. And so I've kind of been able to come in with that. And I actually am still a large proponent of playing decks that feature kind of simpler decks. I prefer playing those decks almost to a fault. And all of that. So I think that's kind of been something that I've been able to kind of have a different perspective on, kind of coming in after all of this, engines are always best has already changed. Other than that, I don't think it gives me too much of unique perspective or anything like that. I'm just trying to look at every board and pick the best thing out there, just like everyone else.
Wow, very interesting. I did not realize that you came into the game so recently either. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I haven't been playing too long, but I've definitely played a good amount since I came into the game. I've packed it in probably a little too much.
Okay, so we're gonna get started with some discussion about your one of your projects. So tell us about Dominion Sparkle.
Yeah, so Dominion Sparkle or Dominion Scavenger, it kind of has the two different names.
It's Sparkle.
I prefer. Some people prefer Sparkle because it's silly, and some people prefer Scavenger because they're a little more serious. So I just keep both of them around, so people can have it be whatever they want. But yeah, that came about because the ratings in Dominion Online don't refresh until every day. at 0 UTC. So I basically started out by wanting a project where I could get the ratings to, get an estimate of ratings more frequently than that. So I made a little application, and it uses the Glico rating system. So I created an application where you could put in an estimate of your results. You could keep track of your results for the day, and input it into this web application. And then you could have it, give you an estimate. So I released that, and then I got a message from Steph, who's the creator of Dominion Online. A few hours later, he's like, "Hey, instead of having people estimate their results, what if I just gave you access to the database and you could get exact results?" And I said, "Sure." And that's kind of where the project really took off. And so now, the website not only has kind of historical results, but also, updated live results. It has a live leaderboard. It has full leaderboards. All of those things are there. And, they're used by a pretty good amount of the community, to have that view and those insights outside of, just the in-game client. But I definitely owe a lot to Steph who made it possible for me to make the website and gave me all the access, and trust that I wouldn't abuse, that access, that he had granted me.
So for those of you who have not gone on Dominion Sparkle, it's a great resource and tool. Especially if you're very competitive and you want to know what your rating is, you can always go and look up your rating, which I do a lot. And sometimes I'm sad when I go on there. It depends on the day, really. Yeah,
I think that there's on the bottom of your current day page, there's kind of a page where what your rating is at the start of the day and then how it's changed throughout the day. And then at the bottom, there's either a little red mark or a little green mark if you've won or lost more than the system has expected you during the day. And I've heard a lot of people say, they love just making that thing turn green, which I guess can be a bit obsessive and sad at times, but it's certainly, it can be a nice resource if you're just trying to figure out how have I been playing lately. It can give you good insight into that. And or at least that's what I use it for.
And also, you do have that little. There's a graph on the bottom that shows your results for the past 2 weeks. That's right.
Yep. And I've been meaning to make that configurable, so that you can view not only the last 2 weeks but whatever time frame you want. But I'm a man with limited time, so it hasn't happened.
Understandable. You do seem very busy. So tell us a bit about what you're now working on or have worked on, but that hasn't come yet to light.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of that. What specifically are you referring to?
Well, in relation to Dominion.
Yeah. So I have several things that I've worked on with Dominion because I'm very probability oriented. I come from I was very involved in the baseball sabermetrics community for a while. Wrote a good amount of articles and did a fair amount of original research in that realm. So I've always kind of been interested in kind of the things what can you control within games, and then how can you use that information to improve your ability to win those games. And so I've built a bunch of different Python scripts, or just scripts that are written in Python that can answer a lot of those questions for me. So different questions like how does inserting certain cards help a deck? So if you have a deck that's fairly junky, and you're trying to draw it every turn, how much does putting a dungeon in the deck or 2 dungeons in the deck, which is, the duration where you draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards each turn, as opposed to putting a warehouse in the deck where it's, each turn you draw 3 and discard 3. What's the difference between those two in different deck types? So I built this tool, that could basically answer those questions for me and give me probabilities of, how many cards you would draw on average, what average turns you would hit if you're trying to play key cards, like say a mountebank or a ghost ship. How often are you going to be able to play those attacks consistently? Those sort of things, as well as This application could also answer other questions like how good is doctor at trashing? So that's a pretty divisive question. And it turns out doctor's actually really good at trashing. It's just not good at getting yourself all the way clean. But some of those findings were really things like dungeon is incredibly good and warehouse is not that good because the start of your turn, seeing more cards at the start of your turn is ultimately what's most important when you're playing not only engine decks, but any deck where you're trying to play a lot of action cards a turn. Because ultimately the driver of how good your turns are going to end up being is highly related to the probability that you kick off. And if you see 7 cards at the start of your turn instead of 5, that greatly increases the chances that you're going to be able to kick off and start playing cards. Because if you only have a 5-card hand to deal with, your turns are going to look so much worse than if you end up playing 20, 25, 30 cards in a turn. So there's definitely, kind of specific probabilities within that. But I think the most useful things that come out of kind of looking at the numbers, looking at the simulations that Dominion can teach us aren't necessarily just in kind of the grand win percentage things, which is kind of what a lot of bots are used for in Dominion now, is comparing win percentages of different strategies. I think a lot of the usefulness comes from kind of seeing what it can tell us about what's important during a Dominion turn and what's important to add to the deck in order to increase your chances of success. And certainly there's a lot more to Dominion than that, but that's a lot of kind of what interests me about the game and what continues to make me play the game to try and figure out how I can do it better.
That's really fascinating. So is this a simulator that you're discussing, or does it go beyond a simulator?
So it's a simulator, but it's a simulator where I can set things up in a bunch of different ways. So it's a simulator where I can say, pretend that it's turn 17. These are the piles. These are everything that's out. And then how is your average turn going to look? So it's not just kind of setting up buy rules and playing entire games, which it has the capability of doing well as well. But I think Geronimo's simulator that he already has that is like very configurable and all that. That's something that mine doesn't do right now. Mine is not very configurable. You have to know how to code to use it and all of that. But I'm not really trying to answer those kind of more big picture questions. I'm really trying to get better ideas of kind of these kind of minute things within Dominion so that I know how much to value cards and how much to value different types of things. So, one example was like the dungeon thing earlier, is you can get up to 7 cards in a turn. You're going to be a lot more consistent as long as your deck is, has any chance. If you have a 100% chance of drawing your deck no matter what, then a dungeon isn't very useful for you. But if you're anything less than that, then the dungeon is incredibly useful. Even if it's moving it yourself from, an 80% chance to draw your deck to a 90% chance, that's a massive difference over the course of a 20-turn game. You get 1 or 2 extra turns that your opponent doesn't if, you have the ability to make yourself that much more consistent. And that's, usually 1 or 2 turns is going to be enough to win you a game. But the same thing can be correlated. So you know that about dungeon. Well, then there's Enchantress, which also gives you 2 cards at the start of your turn. It doesn't make you discard them, which is of some note. Of course, it's terminal, and there's other considerations. Enchantress has the attack on it that prevents your opponent from playing their first card for anything other than a cantrip benefit. But really what I'm looking for is I know how good increasing hand size at the start of turns is. So I know that, putting an Enchantress down every turn and getting those 7-card hands is going to be vitally important because, I've done the research on Dungeon. I know, how important that is. So I can then go into a game kind of with more knowledge of knowing, kind of looking at the board and seeing what I need to do in order to have a deck that functions properly.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So have you run the simulations on Enchantress yet?
I haven't run too much simulation on Enchantress, but I have played a lot with it. And this is something that, I've run by other people. And I think that the attack part of Enchantress is really not the important part. The important part is that if it's the only way to get your hand size up at the start of your turns, getting the hand size up at the start of your turns is just so good that you really need to do it, as long as it's not like you're not short on terminal space where you could do more important things, right? It's not the best thing to do isn't always to get the hand size up at the start of your turns. it's a really good thing to do, but sometimes if there's a really powerful card that you need to play every turn, like Mountebank or Butcher, or some of these other really good cards, then maybe getting an Enchantress down every turn isn't going to be a priority. Or if playing Ghost Ship or something like that each turn is just easier, then you can go do that. But just always kind of knowing, how good that specific aspect of Dominion is. And there's a lot of aspects of Dominion that are very good, but that's kind of one in particular that I think kind of the more you play, the more you realize how important it is to give yourself those options at the start of your turn, because that's really, your turns are very, very frequently the start of your turn is where it's made or broken. It's pretty not too often that you get kind of halfway through a turn where you have a functioning deck and then it stops on you. Or at least that's, that percentage of the time is certainly a smaller percentage of the time that you have those things happen. I'm kind of rambling, I think, at this point, but that's kind of the idea I'm trying to drive at.
No, it's all good info. So have you made any, aside from the dungeon discovery, have you made any other discoveries or have you noticed something that about cards or in general that maybe other players aren't realizing or not really taking advantage of?
Yeah, so I think kind of one thing that I really see is that at the start of games, you really want to trash cards, and you really don't care what they are. You just want to get fewer cards in your deck because all the cards in your deck are bad. And so I think at the start of the game, what you're really looking for is trashing cards. And some things that are like, Doctor is really excellent at trashing cards, and it'll have some games where it doesn't really trash much for you, but it trashes a lot of cards like really frequently. But what it doesn't do is it has trouble getting you all the way clean. So I think kind of one thing that I've kind of learned from this paradigm is I run simulations where I say, what's the average cards trashed by turn 8, by turn 10, by turn 6? And just the best way to really trash and also have your economy going is, if possible, of course, not every board supports this, but if possible, the first trasher that you get should just trash as many cards as possible. It shouldn't get in the way of other things, just trash as many cards as possible. But then you really want to be able to move into getting a card that can clean you up and trash the rest of your cards later. So if you have the option to go and buy a Doctor first, and then secondarily pick up a junk dealer or replace or remodel or cards like that can kind of get the rest of the stuff out of your deck, but that don't trash quite as quickly. That's really a paradigm that you want to try to follow, is kind of go from having that first just mass trashing and then clean up. And that's actually tends to be much faster, like going Doctor into junk dealer, even if you have kind of a bad hand for it, like if you have 3 coppers in your first hand and 4 in the second, so you can't buy it until turn 2, and then you can only overpay 1 and maybe hit that silver that you bought or something like that. You still really want to do that, just because the amount of pace that it's going to be able to give you is much better than if you have to open with a couple of economy cards to get the junk dealer, put the junk dealer in your deck, and then only trash 1 card per shuffle with it. Junk dealer is, of course, still a really good card that can trash 1 card per shuffle and can add economy and target specific cards. But you'd really rather have that mass trasher first and then follow it up with the specific trasher. And of course, every board is different, but that's kind of, again, there's these paradigms that often ring true, if possible. And then you can not follow them, but you need to come up with a compelling reason to do so. That's kind of true of a lot of things of life, is that there's usually best things, and it's often best to not follow the best thing, but you need a compelling reason to do it. So I think that's kind of the simulator is good. Simulators are good at teaching us what those best things are. They're not very good at giving insight into compelling reasons when those best things are not best. But that's kind of where the humans come in, and where a lot of the joy of Dominion is. And of course, Dominion is so different every game that there's a ton of that going on, a ton of trying to figure out what's best, in spite of the usual odds.
Well, I know I pass on Doctor in a lot of games, and probably a lot of people do. So that's definitely very interesting. When I see junk dealer, usually my thought process is I want to get the junk dealer. And if there's Doctor on the board, I'm like, well, I don't really want Doctor. There's junk dealer. So that is an interesting insight. And I'll have to be on the I'll have to be more aware when Doctor's on the board.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I try to evangelize people on is, hey, this card trashes a lot of cards. It's maybe not super fun, but it trashes a lot of cards. Yeah.
Right. But I'm guessing, though, in the case of, say, you have Steward or Amulet, you would probably open those over Doctor.
Usually, yes. So, I mean, there are certainly times where I would open Dr. Steward or Dr. Amulet. Dr. Amulet especially sounds like a really nice opening to me, especially if you have a 4-3. That's another thing. I found that Doctor is much, much better on a 4-3 than a 3-4 because it makes your Doctor not miss the first shuffle. And it just kind of really accelerates things a lot. It makes your guesses able to be a lot better. Of course, 5-2 is the best, but a 4-3 is much better than a 3-4, which is not really something you can control, but it's something you can factor in. So that may be a situation where if I have a 4-3, maybe I'll get a Doctor first and then get an Amulet. If I have a 3-4, maybe I'll skip the Doctor because it's less effective there. And also looking at like how many villages are on the board and that sort of thing, because with Amulet, with Doctor, you get thin really fast. So if you don't really have other villages that are easy to add in, all of a sudden you're going to be having a lot of terminal collision because you're going to have, this 6 or 7 card deck where it's very likely that you're going to have Doctor and Steward or Doctor and Amulet showing up in the same hand. Amulet protects you a little bit from that because it's a duration. So that's why I would lead a little bit more towards Dr. Amulet than a Dr. Steward situation, where with Dr. and Steward, I'd probably just pick one because both of them get you pretty thin pretty quickly. And then you're kind of running into these terminal problems pretty quickly, and Doctor stops being useful pretty quickly. But yeah, it's an interesting question, kind of what trashers to go with when you have multiple options. And it's not one easily answered. But you really need to look at kind of what numbers you want to hit and all of the usual considerations when you're looking at a Dominion board and figuring out what cards are going to be best for your deck.
That is very interesting. So I want to move the conversation in a different direction. Well, not so much a different direction, but so from what I've seen from your posts, and also just based off the simulator you've created and all of your programming, that you have an interest in AI, or that you know a bit about that.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Hey, go ahead with the question.
Okay. So the first question is, maybe you can explain to people what is an AI, at least as it would relate to Dominion or any game in general.
Right. So yeah, I mean, an AI is, a system that makes decisions on a game in the same way that a human would. And now how it goes about making those decisions is obviously way different, right? Because they typically there's a couple different ways to program AIs, right? One is to just kind of put in a bunch of rules and kind of straightforward logic where you say, if you see this, do this. If you see this, do that, so on and so forth. The other way is to kind of have it be much more fuzzy and kind of try to kind of view what's going on and then kind of weigh all the factors and then make a decision off of kind of the sum of those factors. And those are kind of the two basic paradigms behind AI. But yeah, I basically minored in AI in university. So that's kind of where a lot of my AI experience comes from. And I've done some of it. Some AI work professionally, although that tends to be less game related and more kind of anomaly detection of data and that sort of thing, which is certainly patently less fun. But yeah, that's kind of the basic of it.
That is very interesting. So maybe you could help Steph write the AI for Dominion.
Yeah, the tough part with the Dominion AI, and this will always be a tough thing with Dominion AIs, is that there's so many cards. It's not chess or checkers where you're kind of dealing with trying to figure out the logic so much, and that the actual mechanics of the gameplay are simple. The mechanics of Dominion are, of course, fairly simple, but there are so many of them that, any one-man effort is going to have trouble, because you got to program for 300 different cards, and, they all play at least a little bit differently. And so if you're really building an AI that's going to do something, you have to kind of make those considerations and generalizations. And that's it's a lot of work. It's definitely a lot of work. And, Steph, we talked about Lord Raddington and how bad it is. And of course, it's not a very good player, but Steph made Lord Raddington in like a week and a half. And it's not bad. It's not bad for kind of that amount of time and all of the cards that he had to make work for that. And I know he's kind of, that's something he wants to get around to, after he's done with Nocturne and all of these other features, is to, improve the AI, because obviously Steph's a really good player and is capable of making a very good AI system. But it's a challenge just because there's so much to code, not just from a kind of being a good AI perspective, but just from even playing the cards correctly. Yeah,
Lord Raddington has a thing with counterfeits.
Right. Yeah, I have a little bit of insight into how the AI is built for Lord Raddington. So basically, cards have values that are derived from a sum of their parts. So another card that Lord Raddington really loves is Bandit Camp, because Bandit Camp is a village, and it also gives a bunch of economy. And so that's, those are two very good things. And so Lord Raddington looks at that and says, oh, this card is really great. Because not only is it a village, it also gives me, $3. And I think the way it's programmed, it actually gives me $2.2 because it factors in that you're not drawing it or you don't get it immediately. But then the same thing kind of goes for counterfeit, where it's like, hey, trashing is really good. This also gives me economy. And correctly, yes, counterfeit is a really excellent card, but 8 of them in your deck is not. And Lord Raddington has trouble with that concept.
So how would someone go about writing a good Dominion AI?
Right. So there's kind of the two different approaches that I talked about earlier. And I think something that often comes up when people talk about Dominion AIs is, can't we just write something that looks at all of the logs of different top players and then just figures out how to play, and then it's just the best AI in the world? And the answer to that is yes, it's theoretically possible, but it's not really possible. And I'm sort of a pessimist on this. So, I mean, I think, anytime you look at AIs that kind of try to learn from things that have pretty abstract and kind of fuzzy feedback, like game luck. So if someone can win a game and do wrong things in Dominion, and so when you're trying to look at that feedback and all the different decisions within that game, you end up in kind of this very tough position where, how do you tell if something's good or not? How do you tell, how do you generalize, you say you look at a game where Steph is playing Mick, and Steph opens, forager, Steph opens double forager, Mick opens forager silver. And then Steph wins the game. Well, do you say, oh, because of that, if forager is on the board, I'm going to open with 2 of them? How do you relate that back into what the bot's going to be learning and doing? And the answer is maybe, but right, Dominion boards are all different, and maybe forager silver was better. It's really hard to say things like that and to make those decisions on a grand scale. And something I often correlate this to is chess, where there's 2 different types of chess bots. One type is kind of traditionally written, where there's a bunch of logic and rules and different configurations of the chessboard, where kind of the bot knows kind of the best things to do in those situations. And that particular bot is the one that is the best in the world, is better than all the world champions, doesn't make mistakes hardly at all, and that sort of thing. And if it's not solved or anything, but it's incredibly good. And then there's also another chess bot that's made from those other kind of newer AI paradigms, where we're talking about using neural networks and machine learning. And that chessbot is much worse. It's like not even competitive with kind of the traditionally formed one. So we're not really kind of, with the tools we have available for us in AI, we're not really there yet. to be kind of implementing things via neural networks and all that. And if I risk going too far aside here, but all that neural networks are input-output machines that have equations in them that adjust based off of what you tell them. So you have a neural network, you feed it a bunch of numbers as input. So, in the Dominion sense, you could feed it, say, you have one node where you're saying forager, and you're saying percentage of the time you should open forager, and you have another node that's silver, and you feed it as input, and you're saying percentage of the time that you think you should open silver. It then calculates out, based off of a bunch of different factors that it has in its internal equations, and tells you whether you should open forager or silver at a specific time. You would then go in, you would say, okay, it told me to open silver. Here's what happened when I opened silver. And then you go back and change the percentage that you think you should open silver or forager based off of that output. And so that's kind of all you have. You have this input-output machine that rebalances itself based off of kind of how you tell it to rebalance, which is a useful tool. And it's something that really helps AI to have these sort of paradigms available, but it's not something where you can just plug in game logs and it'll just create an AI and it'll just work. It's kind of, this whole question of AI and Dominion is much more difficult than that, to just kind of whip up something to have someone who knows about AI, just build a neural network. And then all of a sudden we have a good bot, right? It's much more difficult, than that to get going. And even once you do get it going, it's never going to be perfect. It's always going to be something that's optimized, but is never going to be perfect. These AI kind of mechanisms that we have, they're all optimizers. They don't seek perfection. They just seek to keep getting better based off of the information that you give them. Very much like a human does, right? That's kind of why these things are artificial intelligence paradigms, because that's what a human does. It seeks to take what it's learned from what's happened and then try to kind of rebalance how it thinks about things and what it thinks it's best, and then kind of move forward. And that's a continual process that kind of keeps going on throughout life. Yeah,
that's interesting. And I was going to ask you about neural networks. So you actually just covered that. So
Good. I definitely felt like I was going kind of way out to the side there, but good that I got ahead of things.
Well, it's good. I mean, it might be a bit complicated for some people, but it's good because AI is kind of a complex subject. At least I think it's a bit complex. I think because unless you have that background in it, it's going to be harder to relate. But I think it's good because it's, you being a programmer and having all this knowledge, it's good to share with that and help explain things, because people are like, why have all the bots sucked at Dominion? Of course, Making Fun, they actually had a decent bot, but people felt it wasn't that good.
Right. Well, Making Fun, right, they had pretty good bots, as long as they didn't have to play an engine. They were completely non-competitive in engines. But, they could play the games that were fairly junky with lots of attacks, and were always going to be money-ish to play competitively. Definitely. And I don't know if the AI things are as complicated so much as they are that I'm not sufficiently qualified to explain them in a way that is not complicated. But yeah, definitely. Definitely a lot going on there, and Making Fun had these better bots, but I think we've never really had a good engine bot, and Dan has actually had some suggestions about kind of how we make a good engine bot that I think makes sense. I've worked on different generalized engine bots before with part of my simulator, and it's what we've kind of learned, and I've talked with Dan about this, and what we've learned is that it's pretty easy to make a pretty competent village smithy market bot, or to extend that to fishing village wharf, those sort of bots. Those are pretty easy to make and to generalize. But then it's really difficult when you start adding in all these other factors. It takes a lot of work. So, how do I add in, all these other cards as well? Because you can make kind of this basic description of a Dominion engine being something that you trash down. You add economy, you add draw, you add villages, you add plus buy. But a lot of Dominion, especially nowadays with empires, is a lot more complicated than that. And so there's just a lot of work to do to make a bot that can really compete with top humans. And I don't know if anyone has really seriously thought about biting that off yet to try and really make that happen, because it is a lot of work.
We need a bot challenge.
Yeah, we do. If Steph could make an API for the online Dominion, I'm sure a lot of people could start making bots, and that would be really cool. And I'm sure people would make some good ones, and I'm sure people would also learn about how hard it is to make a good bot. It is certainly a big challenge. It's certainly much harder than playing Dominion.
I can imagine that being the case. So do you think at some point we will see a bot that can beat Steph or Dan Brooks or even you?
Yeah, even lowly me.
Well, you're actually really high on the leaderboard. Sorry, you're number 6 on the leaderboard, so you're really good. So,
yeah, I mean, I am fairly high on the leaderboard. I'm certainly worse than those top guys. But yeah, I think that it's certainly possible, right? Like, especially when I look at like myself, like I think there's a lot of things that I really don't do that well in Dominion, and a lot of things that I really need to improve on to kind of get to that really top level from where I am now. And certainly, I don't see any reason why we can't create kind of an AI bot. I think that what it's going to take is someone really kind of making that investment. And I think it's going to take a team of people making that investment, mostly just because the volume of considerations that have to be made are so large that I think kind of one person sitting down to do it is never really going to be something. I think it has to be something where it becomes sort of a community project where we try and build something where a bunch of kind of people really come together and we have kind of benchmarks and ways that we can improve on it. You know, you could have things like different bot tournaments and really incentivize people to build these things. That's what it's really going to take in order to make a bot that, you know, it's just, Lord Raddington can beat Steph, but he'll only do it once out of every 400 games. So, you know, to create something that can really compete with Steph and, you know, really just to build something that could say beat, you know, the top players 20 or 30% of the time. I think that's kind of that first step is to get something that's that competent. And certainly it's possible, but there's a decent amount of ways to go and effort and community effort that's going to be needed in order to make that happen. But there's no reason when I look at Dominion that it can't happen. It's just, like I've said a lot, it's a big project. And there's a lot of challenges with making something that has so much kind of knowledge of all of the aspects that you have to think about when you're playing this game.
I would be impressed if there was a bot that could beat the top players 20 to 30% of the time. That would be very impressive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that would be, you know, kind of a bot that could play at a top 200 level, right? Kind of that, you know, that quality, which would be pretty high quality because there's quite a few people play this game. So that'd be pretty competent.
All right. So we've been talking about bots and AI a lot. So let's change the subject because people listening love Dominion. Well, I mean, this is relating to Dominion, but you're number 6 on the leaderboard. So last week we had Dan Brooks, and he gave his input as to how he became a top player, and he gave some advice. What is your advice for becoming a top player? What do you notice that maybe other players can improve on?
Yeah, definitely. So I think kind of the biggest thing that I see kind of a lack of doing, at least that players who are good but not at that top level, is that they don't really look at a board and figure out what they need to do on that board. They can look a lot and figure out what cards are generally good and what cards are going to be good, but kind of looking at the specifics of what you need to do on a board. So of course that's very general. So like an example is a lot of like good players will figure out, hey, hitting $5 on turn 3 and 4 is usually good. And so they'll say, okay, what do I need to do to hit $5 on turn 3 or 4? Because a lot of the $5 cards are, of course, very good. But there's kind of that next step there, which is figuring out how important is it actually to get to that $5. So you can know kind of all the probabilities and you can know how to open to hit 5. That's kind of one of the steps. The second step, and kind of the bigger second step, and something that I've been trying to take recently, is figuring out how important those different things are. So you're always making concessions in Dominion and always making decisions that, there's always opportunity cost to every decision, just like everything. So you have to figure out basically, I'll just bring about an example of, let's say, a board that has Forager and Cultist on it. So, right, it's kind of a classic, how much economy do I take to get Cultist, which is this really good card, and how much do I invest in Forager, which will trash down to get my deck cleaner? And so I'll just ask you, so let's say Forager and Cultist are on a board, only 2 cards, what do you open?
So the question is, only Forager and Cultist is on the board. What do I open?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, if it's just Forager and Cultist, I think, all right, this is going to be Cultist money. But then once you factor in the other 8 cards, that could change what you choose. Yeah. So I would probably open silver if it was just Forager and Cultist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that's absolutely correct. Right. And that's kind of that context that you're looking for, is, based on those other cards, what am I going to open? So, right, if it's just Forager and Cultist, the Forager isn't going to be good enough. You have to have your deck going somewhere. And so, I think there's 3 different basic options if Forager and Cultist are on the board, at least assuming you have a 3-4, which is generally what we assume in these topics. Is if you have 5-2, you're just going to buy Cultist. But if you have a 3-4, right, you can open Forager, you can open Forager Silver, or you can open Silver. And your chances of picking up a Cultist on turn 3 or 4 is vastly different with those 3 different options. If you open Forager, your chance of hitting 5 is only if you draw a 5 copper hand, which is about a 2.8% chance that you're going to get that 5 copper hand, because you have a 1.4% chance of getting any specific hand with 12 cards in your deck. If you open Forager Silver, the math gets a little more complicated because of kind of how Forager works with being more value if treasures are in the trash. But basically you have like a 48% chance of hitting 5. If you open that Forager Silver. If you open Silver, right, you have a 92 or 94% chance, I forget exactly, but you have a very high chance of hitting 5 and picking up a Cultist, as well as you have like a 30% chance of hitting 5 twice. I may be wrong about that. It's been a while since I've looked at these numbers, but you have a good chance of hitting 5 twice and getting 2 Cultists, which if you open Forager Silver or Forager, you have no chance of doing. And so those are kind of all those considerations. But then there's also, on the other hand, the concession of how many cards am I going to trash. So if you open Forager Silver, you're going to be able to trash on average about 0.8 cards. And the reason being because you have this 12-card deck. Forager can sit at the bottom. It's going to sit at the bottom about 20% of the time, a little less than 20% of the time, but about 20% of the time. So you get to trash about 0.8 cards. If you open Forager, that number goes up linearly to about 1.6. But again, your chances of picking up a Cultist are very small. Your opponent picks up a Cultist, they're going to be able to junk you much quicker than you're able to going to be able to get thin, and they're going to be able to pick up more Cultists. Their deck won't, be trashed, but it won't matter. So that's kind of all the considerations you have to make. And I think the answer when you see Forager and Cultist on a board is usually going to be, right, that the correct open is Forager Silver. Like I think you said, looking at what the other kingdom cards are going to be, just knowing that there's generally, you want to end up playing an engine deck in Dominion, and Forager Silver is usually the best way to do that, so that you give yourself a chance of picking up that Cultist, right? It's all about giving yourself chances, but you're also making sure that you're going to be able to maintain some control of your deck. Whereas if you open Forager, you have no chance of picking up that Cultist, and your deck will probably get out of control just because of how good Cultist is. And so kind of going to all of those levels considerations, then being able to do all of that very quickly, even if you don't know the math, because on many boards, you won't know the math. You kind of know the shuffle missing math. You'll know how many cards you'll trash math, at least vaguely. It doesn't have to be in the forefront of your head. None of the top players actually think in percentages. I think I do more than other people, but I don't do it because I think it's useful. I do it just because that's kind of how I think. And so figuring out kind of based on context, it's all about context. It's always looking at the board and figuring out how good are certain things on this board. And that is, learn that at a very early stage, but mastering that is really kind of how to move to that next level, not only knowing how to play, but knowing what's important when you're playing.
Right, right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. For me, I think the majority of the time, I when I see a board, I do try to figure out where the board is going. You know, what is the ultimate goal? I mean, there's some boards you look at it, it's so complicated. And there's like you're like, okay, we're gonna wing it. Of course, even I think Mick Seanock even does that sometimes on some boards. It's like, well, we'll see what happens. But a lot of times,
Right.
I look at a board and I kind of figure out, you know, where it's going to go, and then base the opening buys off that. You know, sometimes too, shuffle luck will change your strategy a little bit too. There's that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't always keep the same strategy the whole game. Sometimes you have to aggressively go for a pile out because you're losing, and your deck takes a completely different turn. And you need to be able to adjust. That's part of Dominion. I think the most important part of being able to adjust within Dominion is based off of if you're ahead or behind in a game. And I think this is something that Steph does much better than anyone else, is when you're ahead in a game, don't take chances. Don't keep buying silver that may clog up your deck. Don't do those sort of things. If you're behind in a game, you might have to take a few more of those chances, but also, be patient. If you can rely on maybe your opponent will make a mistake or have a bad turn, and that can be your way back into the game rather than trying to force things that aren't there. And I think that's something that also really don't force things that aren't there. Don't, early in the game, don't say, well, I'm going to lose if I don't, trigger this bad shuffle hoping to get a specific card. Don't kind of do those wing and a prayer things, because just stay in the game, stay competitive. Don't panic within the game. And that'll really help kind of improve your chances of being able to win on a consistent basis. And there's, of course, so much to playing good Dominion that it's impossible to cover in a podcast like this.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
But that was good advice. Do you have any other... Well, what would you say was the biggest thing that you haven't talked yet about that helped you reach the level that you're at now?
So I think the biggest thing is figuring out, what are my turns going to look like? Like, what's the best thing I'm going to be able to do in a turn? And that's something that I kind of always ask, but I don't think I ever really let it influence your decision making. And so a good example for this question, I think, is, let's say you have a board that doesn't have any plus buy on it. There's no way to buy more than one card in a turn. And just for simplicity's sake, let's say you don't have any gainers as well. And everything on the board cost at least $3, and Steward is on the board. So Steward, right, can trash 2 cards. You have a 5-card hand at the start, so you're going down to $2 if you have Steward. And all the cards in the kingdom cost 3 or more. You only get 1 buy per turn. And so if you are to open with 2 Stewards in this case, what you're going to end up with is you're going to have a lot of turns where you're having $2 and you have to punt on your turn. And you're saying, okay, I trashed 2 cards, great. Usually that's a pretty good turn. But which is usually true, but in the context of this game where you have no plus buy, you can only add 1 thing to your deck per turn. Ultimately, who's going to be ahead or who's going to be behind is the person with the most parts, and not who's thinner, which is not usually true. Usually the thinner player will be able to add cards to their deck, immediately start playing them, and then build a really good deck. But in the context of a game where you have limited things that you're able to do, you really want to focus more on hitting numbers than actually getting thin, because if you're able to hit these numbers consistently, you're going to have more things in your deck than the opponent who gets thinner first. And so actually, like, cleaning up later in that sort of game is the better thing to do, which is kind of counterintuitive to how Dominion normally plays, because normally in Dominion you're able to gain multiple things per turn, have multiple buys per turn, all of those sort of things. So it's kind of just like really contextualizing the board to figure out, what are my turns going to look like? Okay, my turns are never going to be that good because I'm only able to add 1 card per turn, and eventually I'm going to have to start buying provinces, and so my deck's going to fall apart anyways. So I want to make sure I have the maximum good things in my deck so that my average turn can look as good as possible, given the context that I'm only able to add 1 card to my deck per turn. And that's just kind of one example, but there's, all sorts of different things about, what is my turns going to look like? And then how do I get myself there as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible without wasting things? And that's kind of, there's, as with all of these things, there's a ton of permutations within them. But if you're asking those right questions, then you're kind of really able to start improving your game and able to get a lot better at playing boards and at not kind of missing little things within boards that can really make you have wins against players who are playing competitively and who do things that are generally correct, but maybe not, the best thing that you can do on each board.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely true. And so definitely planning your turns out is really important. And for some reason, I'm reminded of Donate, because that's actually a really good example, is Donate, because of Donate, some people love it, some people hate it. But the thing about Donate is that when that's on the board, you have to really, really think how exactly you want your deck to look at it. So I don't know if that's necessarily what you're talking about, but I was reminded.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Donate's a great example, right? It's a really good example because you can plan your turns out so exactly that you really have to think about what your turns are going to look like. So, maybe if someone's new to Dominion, just go play a bunch of Donate games, and then go from there towards cards that are kind of more random.
That might actually help a lot of players if some people did just practice a lot of Donate games. That actually, because that card is. Donate the event is just really good, I think, at helping you really see how, planning in advance.
Yeah.
So we're going to end soon, but is there any last advice that you have for other players?
What's that?
Do you have any other strategic advice or advice to help players?
I'm sure I have other strategic advice. I'm not sure that I have strategic advice that can actually help other players. I think what Mick always says when he's asked for advice is generally just go play a bunch of games, which is of course not always the most helpful thing. But there's certainly truth in that. I think playing games and being conscious of your decisions and just doing that sort of thing. And I think really watching how other people play and being critical of how they play, seeing a lot of different things. There are a lot of times where I don't see kind of these really odd strategies on boards. There are players who are much better than me, like Lime Time, who's the number 3 player right now, is really good at playing kind of like these really strange boards like Talisman Tower, where the goal is just to get a bunch of talismans and then get 10 talismans and then empty a bunch of piles and then get tower points for piles being empty. So I'm not very good at playing those sort of decks. So for me, if I'm wanting to learn, I'll go watch Lime Time play for a while, see kind of what he's doing. Go watch different players play, kind of see what their styles are, and then to some extent emulate them, but also be critical of them, because there's definitely wrong things done all the time by everyone who plays this game, and there's a lot of room to improve. At the top, even though the top players are really excellent and make really few mistakes, they're certainly not inescapable of the woes of Dominion.
That is absolutely true. So that will end our podcast today. It was really great having you today, Breppert.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So next week, the goal is to actually try to have an artist from Dominion on. So I don't know who that artist is because I'm reaching out to a couple of them, but we will see next week and we'll learn about the art of Dominion. So stay tuned. That sounds
excellent.
Yes.
That sounds like a great break from this week, which is just me talking about statistics a lot.
All right. Thank you very much. And we will see everyone next week.
Yeah. Thank you.